welcome to everybody to this second webinar on publishing qualitative studies in academic journals, which, as you know, is part of a series of 4 on high impact research. And once again, these webinars are brought to you by the African Network of Social Entrepreneurship Scholars. At ANSES, as you know, we aim not only to connect us to each other, but also to give you valuable opportunities to improve your research profile, as well as to expose you to funding and other opportunities. And we do hope that these webinars, and this one, today's webinar especially, on high impact research in social entrepreneurship will help you to bolster your research skills. And I welcome all of you, especially our loyal ANSES members, but also other visitors. And to the visitors, if you want to stay tuned and be exposed to similar opportunities in the field of social entrepreneurship, please consider signing up for ANSES membership. And in today's webinar, we focus more on qualitative research. And once again, we believe we managed to bring you one of the most authoritative voices in the field to speak on this topic. I welcome Professor Michael Roy from Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland. You're very welcome.
Thank you.
A few words about Michael. He is Professor of Economic Sociology and Social Policy, and his primary area of research, as you might know, concerns social enterprise and other alternative economic forms. He has written extensively in international journals on the health and well-being impacts of social enterprise, also on policy ecosystems supporting the social economy, and on innovative funding mechanisms such as social impact bonds. And interestingly, this year, 2020, one of his research projects, he's got a few research projects going, but I'd like to mention the one on solidarity in a time of crisis, the role of mutual aid to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is funded by the Scottish Government's Chief Scientist Office. So that's quite timely and interesting, yeah. He also serves as one of 2 change leaders for Glasgow Caledonian University's Ashoka U Changemaker Campus designation. This is quite a interesting designation. If you don't know about it, please go and read up about it. But there's only like 45 campuses such as this one around the world, and it's quite a prestigious title. He was awarded also the Helen Potter Award of Special Recognition in 2017 for the most original article in the Review of Social Economy by the Association for Social Economics, which was founded in 1941 in the United States. And all right, that's quite a bit of an introduction on our authoritative speaker today. And today we call upon his research expertise and his knowledge in the field, but also on his position in different journals. So he's the editor-in-chief of the Social Enterprise Journal. He's associate editor of the Journal of Social Entrepreneurship and serves on the editorial board of Voluntas, the International Journal of Voluntary and Non-Profit Organizations. So since we speak about publishing in academic journals, and Michael fulfills these very important roles, we draw especially on his insights from these positions. So once again, Michael, I'm very glad to have you, and thank you for availing yourself for this webinar.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Now I'm going to try and work out how to share my slides here. So here we go. I'm going to share these slides. Can you all see that okay? I think you probably can now.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to focus on publishing in academic journals. I'm going to focus mostly on qualitative studies, mainly because I don't know anything really about quantitative studies. Although whenever I do quantitative analysis, I always remind myself that I actually probably know more than I think I do. But anyway, I focus mostly on, most of my work is qualitative in nature. So as you said, Alex, and you've saved me probably 5 minutes introducing myself. I'm Professor of Economic Sociology and Social Policy. I work at the UNIS Centre for Social Business and Health, which this year has its 10-year anniversary. And we've been running for about 10 years. Well, we have been running for 10 years because it's our anniversary, but we're one of the largest and I suppose most one of the largest anyway centres in the world for the study of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social economy, that sort of thing. We have a particular focus on health and well-being, but I'll maybe explain a bit more about that later on. I was also, and it's good to see Lauren Tuckerman here, she was involved in this with us, and there's a few people here who were also at ICERC, which is the International Social Innovation Research Conference, which was held this year virtually in Sheffield, but the Sheffield team did a fantastic job. I've been involved in chairing the health and wellbeing stream of ICERC for the last 7 or 8 years now, and I would definitely encourage anyone who wants to be involved in this to get involved. It's a great bunch of people. As you said, I'm involved in social entrepreneurship, Journal of Social Entrepreneurship. Alex Nichols is the editor-in-chief. Also with Voluntas, with Ruth Simza and Taco Branson are the editors, and Sarah App, sorry, as well, are the Susan App even are the editors-in-chief of Voluntas. And I am the editor-in-chief of Social Enterprise Journal for my sins since the start of the year. I'm also involved in the EMES International Research Network, which many of you, I know for a fact, many of you are either members of EMES or have been to the PhD summer school or to the conference. And I've been involved in that for quite some time. Since I was a PhD student, I was the first PhD student elected to the board of EMES. So, considering the social entrepreneurship field, SE field for short, and its evolution up to now, what is the potential contribution of future qualitative studies to the field? Yes, I'm going to use these as a frame, the questions that Alex gave me as the framework for the presentation here. But I'll maybe take my, I'll spin off the questions as well. So it's effectively what we've seen up till now, I suppose, is certainly 10 years ago when Alex was talking about this, was the SE field was in a kind of pre-paradigmatic phase. So we're trying to work out what we're all about. What we saw was endless attempts to work out how to define what we meant by social enterprise, social entrepreneurship. We had crude attempts, I suppose, to count the numbers of social enterprises or the types of things that we wanted to be involved in. We've seen endless case studies describing them, but the case studies we saw were far too uncritical. We saw a very firm focus on what we call the heroic social entrepreneur figure. Far too many uncritical case studies. So the field is now maturing. We're moving into a far more critical and reflexive phase. I would suggest what we're seeing is methodologies coming into the field now from a whole series of disciplines who are frankly further ahead than we are, things like public health, from mainstream management, from political economy, so on and so forth, sociology. So whether the SE field is a field in its own right or not, I don't really know, but I suppose it's a subfield of a whole series of different disciplines, perhaps. So what's the point in qualitative methods? What do they aim to do? Well, first of all, the whole point of them is to make sense of or interpret social phenomena so that they, you know, in terms of the meanings that people bring to them. They also, they help define preliminary questions too, which can then perhaps be addressed in quantitative studies. It doesn't have to be preliminary questions, of course. It could be, you know, fully blown studies could all be qualitative, but very often we could use them in parallel with or in conjunction with quantitative studies. They address a problem usually through a clearly formulated question, although it doesn't obviously follow that there has to be a strict question. And perhaps using more than one research method too. So we try to do this triangulation if we can. And what I should say is that analysis of qualitative data can and should be done using explicit, systematic, reproducible methods and so on. Now, what I mean by that is that qualitative methods does not mean, or qualitative studies does not mean really that anything goes. Okay, it's just a free-for-all that you can make it up as you go along. And basically you have to set out quite firmly what it is you've done and so on. I'll talk about that more clearly in a second. So part two, what sort of unanswered research questions are out there that could be answered with qualitative research? And I thought, oh my goodness, where do you start? The standard qualitative questions, I suppose, the types of qualitative questions that we see on the left-hand side here are the sorts of things that I suppose are specifically geared for qualitative methodologies. So why people behave the way they do, how opinions and attitudes are formed, how people are affected by the events that go on around them, how and why cultures are developed in the way they have, and the differences between social groups, importantly. So the types of things that questions that might be relevant to social enterprise or social entrepreneurship are, for example, why do people start up social enterprises in times of crisis? What does the general public think about social enterprise? Does it actually matter what the general public think? What happens when a social enterprise closes down? What happens to the people involved? Do they just go away and do something else, or what happens to them? In what ways does different cultures, for example, in South Africa, influence the type of social enterprise we see? In what ways is that different across different cultures? I know for a fact that South Africa is a very multicultural country, state, and social enterprise is probably going to vary quite widely depending on where it is regionally, and the cultural influences that influence the type and the form that it takes. Diane Holt does a lot of this kind of work, particularly in different sub-Saharan countries. And the differences between social groups, you could say, how does race, gender, or income level influence who founds a social enterprise, for example? So these are all the types of questions that social enterprise, the qualitative research is designed to look at. So part three here is, are there any qualitative methodologies that we should or get to know well because they hold more promise for building or extending theory? Now, the answer to that is obviously, of course there are, but I want to focus specifically on the three approaches that people often think about or go to when we think about qualitative research, post-positivist type approaches. So grounded theory, ethnography, or phenomenology. And when we talk about constructivist philosophy or constructivist paradigms, then grounded theory is often trotted out. It was one of the first post-positivist methodologies to appear in the 1960s by Strauss and Corbin. And it's effectively, for the reason given there is to develop theories grounded in the study data. The second one there is ethnography, and we had a special issue on ethnography in Social Enterprise Journal, I think just a couple of years ago. Mike Rowe, Simon Teasdale, and a few colleagues did a nice special issue on this particular topic. And effectively, that's about understanding cultures from the point of view of the study subjects, usually through immersion within a particular setting over an extended period of time. Third one there is about phenomenology, and describe the essence of a phenomenon by exploring it from the perspective of those who experience it, so as to understanding the meaning participants ascribe to that phenomenon. So those are the types of standard approaches taken that people will be familiar with when they think about qualitative research. However, I've been looking at this really since I did my PhD. It wasn't actually that long ago. So what I wanted to do was think about, are there theories that allow for both structure and agency? Particularly when we think about entrepreneurship, we have to have an entrepreneur. We have an enterprise, we have to think about an enterprise and who starts an enterprise, etc. So, but of course, enterprises and entrepreneurs are embedded in social contexts. So are there theories out there that allow for both structure and agency, and perhaps combine, you can have your cake and eat it. They combine the best features of both positivist and post-positivist or constructivist paradigms. Now, you could, of course, look at things like structuration theory, which is the work of Anthony Giddens in particular. I'm most drawn to critical realism, however, and I'm a critical realist. So the work of Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, Lawson and others, they've been looking at how to combine the notion that there are things, there are objects in the real world, but there are also structures that influence how those agents can behave or not, that are restrict or enable the role of agents. Now, I've been doing a lot of work, particularly in realist evaluation, which comes from a realist theory of science, and effectively realist evaluation assesses what works for whom and in what circumstances. So it assesses the context, mechanisms, and outcomes in which phenomena take place. And I'll explain a bit more about this like this. So basically what we see is in the middle here. So for example, if you think about it as a social enterprise, we see social enterprises do all sorts of stuff. And then at the other end, there are all sorts of outcomes. You know, people have become more confident, people are more able, people are more engaged, people get higher levels of education, people have get better skills and so on. But what happens in the middle? What happens in the middle? What is it about the social enterprise specifically that helps those people transform those activities to those outcomes? So I thought effectively the realist evaluation is about unpacking the black box there. And they do this in various ways, but effectively they try and organize things across these context, mechanism, outcome frameworks. So what you have is the different activities. Then you have the resources, the opportunities, the constraints, which people are very familiar with if you're a social entrepreneurship scholar. Then you have people's reasoning, their preferences, their norms, their beliefs, etc. These are the kind of mechanisms at play. And then you have the outcomes, the choices, the decisions that people make on the basis of that. There's been some really interesting and very complicated and exciting work that's come out, particularly from public health, over the last maybe 10 years. But the people here, the Ramesses network, they've been working on this and trying to develop or standardize some of this stuff. So the types of context and mechanism outcomes, configurations are, for example, people with increasingly complicated conditions. Program leads decide to develop a new program to support a particular population, for example, and then we see improved program outcomes. So participants' health and well-being may increase, for example, and there's all sorts of different ways you could measure or evaluate or whatever you want to do the outcomes there. So I want to stop at that particular point just for a minute, because I think that we've probably reached, I've been talking for about 10 minutes now. I probably reached a point where for people just to have a think and to see if there are any questions. Do we have any questions from anyone?
Well, Michael, perhaps I will ask a question because I see that Alex has disconnected, so he might have a problem.
Yeah.
I saw when you were talking about the different questions that you typically answer in qualitative studies. Some of them, given that I typically do qualitative studies, I was thinking some of those questions could easily also be answered through more data-driven analyses. Is the choice also sometimes dependent upon the data availability, given that typically, yeah, of course, qualitative is more a small sample, while quantitative is more large sample. And how do you see the relationship between the two?
I think they have to be complementary, Philip. I think to answer the first part of your question, I fully accept that the choice of your methods, and it really comes down to a variety of different components. First of all is, yes, the availability of data, but it's also about the availability of the skills of the researchers as well, of course, and what type of questions you want to answer. Or do you want to ask as well? The type of question you want to ask is obviously going to have to feed into the way you want to ask the question. So, and therefore the type of data you're going to generate. Of course, it doesn't actually follow that that you can work with very huge amounts of qualitative data, but of course the data very quickly becomes unwieldy when you go over any more than maybe 30, 40, 50 interviews, then it becomes crazy the amount of data you have. So just dealing with those large, the large amounts of data is very, very difficult. But yeah, that's I suppose a very pragmatic response to your question, Philip.
Yeah. Perhaps there is a question from Judith, unless Alex, you want to take over? Okay, so Judith asks, how do you define the unit of analysis? For example, on the slide, you show example of questions to answer using qualitative method in social entrepreneurship. What does general public think? How can you define who are the general public? Is it just an individual you meet in the street, government institutions, public agency? So it's true that the choices that you make in qualitative studies is of course very important. While in quantitative, it's always easy. How do you go about that, Michael?
Again, it comes back to what question you want to ask. You want to answer. Really, I mean, the general public. For example, if a public policy maker has if people, for example, public policy says, wouldn't it be great if everyone in the general public knew what a social enterprise was or knew what a social entrepreneur was, because because that way the general public might understand, might have greater affinity with them, might buy more from them, for example. Well, then, you would need to set out, well, what do we mean then by the general public? And the general public might just be something which reflect, a sample that reflects the entire public, If, however, it was about, but that's not a qualitative question, that's a quantitative question, I suppose. But if, yeah, so as I said, it really goes back to what question you want to answer, and it's the type of methods you employ are obviously have to be derived from that. Is basically the main point.
Yeah, I think Judith raised her hand. So Judith, perhaps you want to ask your question?
No, I think I understand. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, shall I continue then, or what do we think? Do we
okay, I might have a question for when you're discussing the idea of your philosophy of approaching social enterprises, like you're saying that you're a critical realist. Is it really important? Because we what with this, one of the prominent scholars, but coming from from a pragmatism school, like in the United States, and she was saying that it's not really important why we should bother with the idea of philosophy of science. So however you are approaching, it's very obvious that you are stressing this, and you are actually departing from the idea of being a critical realist. Is it really important?
Well, it's important to me because I have a PhD. A PhD is a doctor of philosophy, and if you don't understand the philosophy of science, then how did you pass your PhD? I mean, there has to be a philosophy component because that's where you're getting your doctorate in. So effectively, philosophy is either implicit or explicit in everything you do. So it has underpinning values. It has so if you make a decision, for example, not to make your philosophy so apparent in the work that you're doing, you're effectively taking a decision, probably a political decision, not to reveal what your philosophy is. I genuinely don't understand what the problem would be. Effectively, your ontology drives your epistemology, which drives your methodology, which drives your methods. So these things are all interconnected, and whether they're interconnected or not, you should certainly be aware that they're interconnected. If that makes sense, Mohammed. So I actually don't agree at all with the premise that philosophy doesn't actually matter, because it matters a very great deal.
Yeah, but just to make sure, just maybe to our audience, critical realism is not the only school that we should follow in social entrepreneurship, right?
Oh my goodness, no, not at all. No, you can come at this any direction you like. Sorry if I misunderstood your question. What I'm getting at is that you can come at this from a positivist, very interpretivist, or any kind of thing in between. What you need to be sure of is you're using methods that link clearly with your philosophical background, your discipline, your methodology, the tradition, how you've been trained, all that sort of stuff. And you just need to be aware of that. It's about awareness of where you're coming from. That's all I'm saying about if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Karen, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, Michael.
Hi,
thank
Karen,
you so
how you
much.
doing?
It's really good to. I'm good, thank you. I'm well.
Good.
I'm really enjoying exactly what you've said. And I've literally been working on my methods chapter, so this is really resonating with me. So I stumbled, as I do a lot in my PhD, on the pragmatic paradigm, which was talking to the mixed methods approach, which sounds like it talks very nicely to what you're saying in terms of structuration theory or critical realism, in terms of that there's a practical reality and that the research has a pragmatism to it. Yeah. Are you able to just give a little bit more information on both of these theories that you've outlined? I think they could be very useful to me.
Yeah, I mean, there is a pragmatic school, which basically says that they don't want to set their camp one way or the other, and critical realism to some extent it is a pragmatic philosophy, and you can use all sorts of different methods, and indeed it works very clearly. So what I would say is critical realism is a small p pragmatic philosophy, whereas there is a philosophy called pragmatism, which basically says that doesn't want to make any particular perspective or the other. But I do think that you need to set out when you're doing your PhD. It's very clear. You need to set out what the PH is in your PhD, Karen. So you need to work out what your philosophy is, and then work out the methods and the epistemology and the methodology and methods that you're going to use and where they come from, because I think that's important. I think it's really important that you get to know. But I fully agree with you. Pragmatism and critical realism are very much interlinked. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Michael, perhaps a few more before we continue, because otherwise the questions are going to keep coming. Okay. I see a couple of questions on sample size, saturation, and also one in which says, how do you, can the results be contaminated by personal feelings and beliefs of the researcher? So of course, yeah, I guess the answer is that it can be, but perhaps the more relevant question is, how do you make sure that you control for that, or you try to avoid that? So about sample size, saturation, and let's say researcher involvement.
Yeah, sample size is a tough one. Basically, sample size should generally speaking, qualitative research should be judged by, you've reached theoretical saturation, they call it. In other words, you study enough so that you understand enough about a phenomenon that if you do any more, then generally speaking, you're not adding any more to what you've already known. So coincidentally, for most PhDs, it tends to be around 30 interviews, but I suspect that's more down to the PhD supervisor saying you must do 30 interviews because 28 doesn't sound right, and 32 is probably a bit too much. So saturation it's a bit of a interesting debate and topic, but it's one I'm actually going to touch upon soon. And sorry, your third sample size again. I've heard of people who have done their whole PhD on one focus group, for example. And it's not about how many; it's about what you do with what you've got, because you're not generalizing to a larger population. At least that's not the point of qualitative research. It's about coming up with plausible outcomes as a different form of generalizability. I suppose it's something like theoretical generalizability or something. So it's very different from quantitative research in terms of what's intended to do. But it's just about having, I'm actually going to mention saturation in a second. So perhaps what I'll do is if you don't mind, I'll start again. I'll start and then I'm going to show a series, and it's going to have a series of boxes And then it is, yeah, see, so I mentioned, so the number of things I'm going to mention here, probably I suspect some of the people are going to say, hang on, you haven't mentioned this, you haven't mentioned that. Well, I've got a whole screen here of, 16 things that perhaps people can look at. I don't know how much this helps, but and you're covering, there we go, I'll put you down here, the cameras. Okay, so what makes it, so the question was basically, what are some of the most important considerations when designing high impact qualitative studies and getting them published in high tier journals? This links to what you just said there, Philip, in terms of the types of things, what makes a good qualitative study? So first of all, it has to link to appropriate theories, it has to be framed appropriately. There has to be methodological clarity and coherence. So this links to what I said earlier about linking your ontology, epistemology, methodology, methods clearly together. So there has to be some kind of philosophical coherence to what you're doing. This then links to the next question around inference. Now, when you're doing quantitative, it's always deductive inference, obviously. But people think that qualitative research is actually just about, inductive inference. This is grounded theory method in particular. You go naively into a setting, and then you without knowing anything about anything that's going on, and then somehow I'm dramatizing here. Somehow you're working out in a very naive way what's actually going on. In practice, of course, that actually never happens. You have to do your literature review, for example, before you even go into the field to work out what it is you're trying to work out. So really what you're doing is not inductive inference really at all. It's actually an engagement. What you're doing is you're shuttling backwards and forwards between the data, the emergent theory, and the literature, what's known before. So you're shuttling backwards and forwards in what's called abductive inference, or perhaps you come up with something a surprising finding, and you think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why that happens. So you say, oh, that's, surprise, the element of surprise, I called it there. The whole thing about qualitative research is that you can go into the field and you think, oh my goodness, what's going on here? This is really interesting. I wonder if anyone else has seen this before. So then you go back to your computer and you have a look, and then you find out 25,000 people have looked at the same phenomenon before, and you think, oh, perhaps it's not that interesting or novel. But actually what I'm looking at here is actually different from what they've said. So then you have a think, and then you try and work out what novel take you might have on this particular phenomenon. So basically what you're doing is you're performing abductive inference here. And actually fits well with the critical realist philosophy as well. And the philosophy of, for example, Charles Sanders Peirce or Roy Bhaskar. How many interviews is what I just mentioned there. It really depends. But what you need to do is you need to set out how many you've done. Why or how did you choose your sample? You also need to describe your sample. Where are you sampling from? What does your population look like? Is it 25 social enterprises, for example, in South Africa? Well, how many social enterprises are there in South Africa? Do we actually know? Then you need to describe your sample, and you also need to say who you talk to. For example, if it's in-depth semi-structured interviews, for example, why did you decide to pick these people and not those people? Why did you decide to pick leaders of social enterprises rather than the middle managers or the people that they're supporting, for example? And then this whole question around how did you know you'd reached saturation? But you need to say how you found that, how you worked that out, or how you decided. There's actually quite a lot of papers on this. I've been looking at this topic fairly recently. So have a look at some of the papers that are out there on the topic of saturation. You need to also present your paper properly, and presenting your paper properly means using verbatim quotes. So you have to give comfort both not only to the editor of the journal, but to the reader, that you did actually undertake these interviews. You did actually do what you said you were going to do. So you need to present quotes which show how, that your findings just didn't come out of thin air, they didn't come out of the ether. You also need to describe what you used to support your analysis. I mean, did you use in vivo, for example, or some other kind of tool to organize your data? And then what was your method of analysis? How did you analyze? I mean, everyone talks about thematic analysis, but very often I would question as to whether they're actually using thematic analysis or whether they're using some other thing that they don't know the name of. There's various different types of analyzing qualitative data, different types of coding, for example. You need to code the data. So, and there's a whole manual of different ways of coding data, depending on what the topic it is you want to find out. Johnny Saldana has basically written the Bible on coding of qualitative data. Then at the end, you need to say, what is it we know now that we didn't know before? And then the whole thing about, so what? Who cares about this stuff? You know, at the end of the day, you said all this stuff. What do we know now that we didn't know before? And who is it relevant to? Is it relevant to policymakers? Is it relevant to other academics? Is it, you know, is it a contribution to theory? Is it a contribution to policy? Who's it a contribution to? So those are the types of things that create, I suppose, a good qualitative study. And those are all the types of things that you would like, probably need to see if you were publishing this in a quality journal. So I could stop there for a second if you want. If I could take a couple of questions. What do we think?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Philip, if you don't mind, I was kicked out a few times with the power cut. So I think I missed on some comments.
Okay, but you can go ahead if you want, Alex. No? I don't know if there was one question with regard to grounded theory method. Isabel asked that question. Goya, grounded theory, data analysis and qualitative research is very much praised and even expected the work to be published. Any comments on this and maybe hints to alternatives in this regard?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again, Philip?
Well, so the Goya grounded theory approach, which I guess assumes that organizational phenomena are socially constructed by people who know what they are trying to do and can explain their thoughts. Is there any possible hints of alternatives in this regard, or are we all kind of stuck with this?
No, I mean, there are all sorts of different ways in which you can approach your data. I mean, just as what I said earlier, in terms of, I mean, the only trouble with grounded theory method is that, you know, it's been attacked by people over many decades, you know, but it came out at a particular time in the, you know, post-positivist era in science in the 1960s. So it wasn't fully formed at that particular time. So people have quite some preconceptions about grounded theory method. And to be honest, it has developed, particularly in recent years. So for example, the work of Kathy Charmas on constructivist grounded theory, very, very interesting and holds a great deal of promise, I think. But it just needs to be done properly. I mean, that's the bottom line, is that science just needs to be done properly. And the trouble is, of course, properly means different things in different contexts. So I suppose what I'm trying to do here is tell or to show you what I would do. I'm not saying that I am the authority on how to do qualitative research, but effectively I am a journal editor though, and what I can do is give feedback on, you know, if I get a paper in, then what am I looking for? What are the signs of a good qualitative piece of work? So I suppose there isn't any right or wrong way to do things. All I'll say is that there are many ways to do it, and one way is as good as another, as long as you do it properly. Yeah. I don't know if that answered that question very well.
Yeah, perhaps one which I struggle also with, and I see that Nadine has asked that questions. Feels like social entrepreneurship, social innovation, social enterprise draw from many different disciplines. And it's true that I think that we use quite a bit of outside ideas, outside theories, and we try to put it in perspective, how it can be used or can be applied in social entrepreneurship. But often you get reviewers that don't really see the merits of the social part of it. And so you get attacked a little bit by both sides. So how important is it to stay faithful to any particular one for our thesis, but also getting published. And I sympathy with that question.
I sympathise with that as well, and frankly, because it's difficult. It's difficult to find. It really depends on where you go. These days, it's actually better than it used to be. So if you were, and Diane Holt will know this better than I will, frankly, because she publishes in higher, tries to publish in the management journals, for example. And the management journals are really tough. They can be quite conservative as well in terms of what they do, but they're also published some really wonderful, really very, very good, very fine work. It just sometimes is a bit boring as a sociologist, you know what I mean? But effectively, you just need to try different tactics, and going back to this with the question that Karen asked earlier about taking a pragmatic perspective, if you've done a piece of work on a phenomenon which you can convince people is interesting, then as long as it's done well and it's done properly, then it will get published. Depends where it gets published. There's some of the really top journals, in particularly American journals on management, tend to be heavily dominated by quants people, and it tends to be people who can write a certain way, and it's quite a kind of closed shop. It's difficult to penetrate those journals, frankly. So the question is whether you even try, or whether I've never published in non-profit voluntary sector quarterly, for example. But I'm determined to publish the top journal in American journal for this particular topic, but it tends to publish the types of stuff that I'm not very good at. So high volume quantitative pieces, which I tend not to do. But I have published, tell you what, I've published in some of the top public health journals in the world. Published in Canadian Medical Association Journal, 8th top journal, medical journal in the world. Published in Social Science and Medicine, again, 4-star journal in the Association of Business Schools rankings. So, you'll find a home, and you'll find a good home. If you've done good science, you'll find a really good home for your article. I don't doubt that for a second.
Diane, I see that. Did you want to say something?
Oh, well, I can if you want me to.
Yes, please.
So I think in terms of the management journals, there's a huge opportunity at the minute, because they are desperate for different contexts, and they're desperate to test the boundaries of theories that exist. And this is something that's getting much more traction than in the past. And yes, we got a piece published in Journal of Product Innovation Management recently that was a big qualitative study, and also a piece that's just coming out in the Journal of Macro Marketing. And the reason for that is because of the fact that the data is so unusual. And I think particularly for those of you researching in the sub-Saharan African context, you can't underestimate how rare your data actually is. And so this is where I think you have to box a bit clever and think about, who can I partner with, who understands that universe, who understands the context of these very high ranked management journals, and what is looking for them. And some of these, particularly special editions, the last 2 of ours have been special editions where I've partnered with somebody who's part of those networks, who understands those journals, understands the way that they expect the narratives to emerge. And it's been really hard. I mean, the JPIM paper took, it was a year at least of once it was written. But it is possible, but I think you have to think really about how you can maximize your ability to penetrate those networks. And that to me would be but to not underestimate how unusual and rich your data can often be. And it doesn't mean that you just have to collect data from developing world context. I mean, Michael's done some amazing work at showing kind of data from parts of the UK that people don't really talk about much, so, and sectors and things. So I think that would be my contribution to all of that.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, Diane.
I see that Ulla also has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting discussion. one thing that you pointed out, Michael, was about the transparency from the data into the coding and then to the findings. And do you have any sort of concrete suggestion? Because we all know that it's a very messy and iterative process. So any concrete suggestions, recommendations, how one does this, how to achieve this?
No concrete ways, but it's just, you've just actually reminded me, I didn't answer a question that was mentioned earlier about the subjectivity of the research, or the position of the researcher, because this kind of links to that question as well. Because there's different ways you can show this kind of transparency, if you like, and in some ways it does come down to subjectivity to a great extent. It really does. But the thing is to relish that and to recognize it and not try to hide it. It's about this comes back to something I said earlier as well around paradigms and around the way we think, and making sure that the way you're coming from actually comes through in your text. So in some ways, it's, you're trying to bridge this subjectivity objectivity divide, and it's very, very difficult. The transparency thing, I suppose, is around making sure that the text is verbatim, so you're showing the verbatim text. But very much the way you guarantee this transparency thing is through very clearly outlining what methods you followed, in terms of who you asked, why you asked them, the number of interviews you undertook, how long were the interviews, where did you undertake the interviews, what kind of interviews did you do? Did you do an in-depth semi-structured interview? Was it an unstructured interview, or was it more a kind of survey type approach, that type of thing, or was it a survey plus prompts, that type of thing? So I suppose that gets around the transparency thing. But what I say about the transparency is that there's going to always be an element of subjectivity to it, which is why it's very important. And it's very important, and I'll say this to the PhD scholars in particular, because I know we have some PhD students here. There has to be, particularly if you're doing a sociology or a PhD, which expects some degree of subjectivity involved, you have to reflect upon your own values and your own role in shaping what you found out. We call that reflexivity. It's effectively just to reflect upon your own part in the process and the way that may or may not have influenced the outcomes that you saw. So I'm trying to combine the two answers to one question there. So sorry about that. That hasn't come through very clearly.
Thank you.
Hi, Michael. It's Lauren Janklowitz.
Hi, Lauren. How are you doing? Congratulations on your PhD and your Viva, your passing and everything, your defense. That was fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the fabulous feedback that will result in hundreds of papers.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear.
To answer all of the questions that you posed, important questions. What I wanted to know was just with regards to what kind of journal you apply for. Do you go for the journal that you think is your home, or do you start with the very, very top in the hopes that you might receive some good feedback and then adjust it into the journal, or do you aim lower from the beginning? What would be your recommendation in the management kind of space? I'm going
to cover that in a few minutes, actually, Lauren. So I'll hold off and I will answer that question because the answer is it depends. Is the short answer to that question, but I am actually going to cover that in a wee second. So I promise I'll. But if you want to talk to me, you can talk to me anytime about publishing strategies and stuff for yourself. It's absolutely no problem. We can talk.
Awesome, thank you, Mike.
No worries. I'm going to talk again for a few minutes, if that's okay, because I think we're now heading into, people are actually asking quite granular questions around publishing and stuff. So I think that's a good thing. So it's a nice segue into what I'm going to talk about next, and hopefully it will satisfy some of Lauren's questions as well. So the first question here is, what are some of the most common features of qualitative papers that a desk rejected? Right, believe it or not, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, they all have the same. So what does an editor-in-chief look for when a paper is received? Well, first of all, does it fit with the scope of the paper? 99% of the papers that are desk rejected are because they've got absolutely nothing to do with social enterprise or social entrepreneurship. Honest. You'd be amazed at the number of papers we get people just submit them to willy-nilly to any old journal, and I have to desk reject them more or less every time. What you need to do here is to make sure that, therefore, that it fits with the scope of the journal, and you're showing these signifiers to make sure that the editor understands that you fit with the scope. And you do that by making sure that there's a good title, the keywords and the abstract all have some relevance to the journal itself. You can easily see what the scope of the journal is from looking at the journal online. References, incredibly important, right? And this is very important, particularly for those who do a revise and resubmit of a paper that's been rejected elsewhere. You can't just lift your paper, it's been rejected, and then immediately fire it off somewhere else, okay? That way it will get desk rejected, or you increase your chances of being desk rejected. The reason for that is that in order that the editor is looking at this very quickly, what he's looking at this is to see, making sure, is this within the scope of the journal? How do I know it's within the scope of the journal? Well, what literature does it reference? So I immediately go to the reference list. And if I see papers in Social Enterprise Journal, then I know at least they've engaged with the conversations within the journal. Or it doesn't have to be Social Enterprise Journal, your Journal of Social Entrepreneurship, Voluntas, something along those lines. Okay, but not Journal of Clinical Epidemiology or whatever, you know, it needs to be relevant to the topic, okay? Second thing is, unfortunately, if you're publishing in English, then the quality of English has to be excellent, has to be understandable, spelling has to be reasonable, it has to be consistent. So you either have to be British English or American English and not a combination of the two. Format, it has to be in the format of the journal. Now, some journal editors, me included, are a wee bit lax about this. We're not completely anal about it, but as long as it's broadly and looks like a paper that's suitable to be published in Social Enterprise Journal, then fine. However, if I see something which has been written for a law journal, which has got loads and loads and loads of footnotes, for example, I would think, why do they want to publish it in Social Enterprise Journal? Perhaps it was a revise and resubmit from the Journal of Harvard Law Review or something. Perhaps not, but who knows? Is it too long or too short? Does it look and feel right? You know, so that's a really tough one. Again, it's a very subjective thing, but effectively, is it all over the place? Is the text all the same height? Is it in paragraphs, or is it just one solid block of text? All of these are red flags, frankly, that will alarm an editor-in-chief. The last thing you want to do is alarm your editor-in-chief, because it will just be desk rejected. Therefore, what are the kinds of things that we look for? Well, does not fit with the scope of the journal, as I said, is by far the most obvious reason that things are desk rejected. The language, if it's too poor, if it's too dense to follow, then again, it's going to be rejected. Does not engage in ongoing conversations within the SE field. This is what I mean about making sure that you don't just reference them and reference it on a very superficial level. You actually have to look at the journal, look at the papers that have been published on your topic, on or near your topic, and then make sure that it's correctly formatted as well. So you get a big red rejected thing if you don't follow these things. And it's actually not hard to do these things, but you'd be surprised at how many just think they'll just send them off willy-nilly. So that's where we are at the moment. So this is the actual question that Lauren asked me. So should I target a journal from a research design stage or once my manuscript is ready for submission? And where should I target? Choose your journal as soon as you can, as soon as reasonably practical in the process, because what you're going to need to do is frame your paper appropriately for the journal, using literature from the journal you're targeting, if you can. You need to think about your publication strategy though, and you also need to take advice from more experienced colleagues, supervisors on where to target. This goes back to Diane's point about partnershiping and working with people. So for example, you might have the data, but you haven't got hope in hell of publishing in Academy of Management Review, for example, but do you have a pal who has published in Academy of Management Review? Well, perhaps you can partner and you can do something that can help you to negotiate that. So you need to think about as well in terms of where you are in your career. And for PhDs, for example, do you need to publish? Do you need, how many do you need to publish? Where do you need to publish? This can really vary according to your country, your discipline, even between institutions. But very importantly, you have to be realistic, okay? Yes, aim high, aim as high as you possibly can, but not every paper can go into a world-class journal. What I will say though, that every journal the journal has to be reputable. So it's listed in Scopus, impact factor, etc. So learn how to recognize predatory journals. So to answer Lauren's question, it's good to aim high, but you need to be sensible about it. No, unless you are some kind of savant, you're not going to be publishing immediately into Academy of Management Journal or whatever, Academy of Management Review. You're going to build up to that. So you might want to publish in Social Enterprise Journal, you might want to publish in Voluntas, whatever. And then basically the most important thing is that you're demonstrating trajectory in terms of the quality of the journal that you're targeting. And indeed the discipline you're publishing in. However, there will be some papers that you publish and think, you know what, this is actually targeting people I'm speaking to the field in which I operate here. I am deliberately targeting Journal of Social Entrepreneurship, for example. Published a paper recently on the relevance of Cal Polanyi to social enterprise scholarship. No, apart from social enterprise scholars are interested in that. So I'll put that into Journal of Social Entrepreneurship because I know that people who are interested in Polanyian scholarship and indeed social enterprise or social entrepreneurship will find that that's a really interesting thing, because you know what, when I was a PhD student, I wish that paper existed. And you work collaboratively, half the effort, twice the reward. So basically, beware of predatory journals. I'm coming to the end of what I'm talking about here, but basically what I'm saying is that this is a craft skill, okay? It's not actually unlike painting or sculpting or something like that. If the very first time you sculpt something and you sell it to, I don't know, the New York Gallery or something like that, and then people think you're some kind of savant, the chances of that happening are very few and far between. The people who sell their sculptures to the top galleries or the top art people in the world are people who have been doing it for a long time, and there's a lot of broken pots under their table, which basically says that they've had lots and lots and lots of practice in order to perfect their craft. Writing papers is a craft skill. You do it, the more you do it, the better you become at it. And that's basically all I've got to say on the topic. So I expect you've got quite a few questions, I would imagine. You can always email me as well, by the way. So.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think I've learned a lot, definitely. I come more from a quantitative background, and I'm definitely more interested and captivated by qualitative research today and going forward. Perhaps there are a few questions that we glossed over. There was no time earlier. Do you mind if maybe I ask a couple of them? Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can, Alex.
Okay. All right. There was a question from, let me find it. There was a question from Joshua about data triangulation. You spoke about it earlier on, and we would like to hear a little bit more about it. To do triangulation, do we need to change our method, or are we changing the source?
Yeah, both or either of those things. I won't say that triangulation is always necessary, but what I'll say is that it's good to get corroboration. So, for example, if you've got a hunch over something and you've seen something emerge, then sometimes it's a good idea to look at it from a different direction. So perhaps using a different method, or speaking to another person, or going to a different source, or something along those lines. So that's, I suppose, what we mean by triangulation. And you can do different methods of triangulation depending on what you're trying to triangulate. I know that's a bit of a cop out there, but effectively, yeah. And there's books written on this topic. So if anyone's more interested in that, then they definitely should. It's not, as I said, it's not absolutely vital, but effectively, if you've got the weight of triangulation, effectively triangulation is a form of, the more you do, the more interviews you do, the more your data is triangulated, because effectively what you're seeing is the same phenomenon, perhaps appearing in your, and you're seeing it from all sorts of different directions. The same people are talking about the similar thing. And that might be, for example, if we're talking about organizations, you might actually see the same thing in a different organization as well. Or you might see a different thing happening in a different organization. And that raises other questions as, A, if it's the same, then why is it the same? Or if it's different, then why is it different? You know, so you then have to go back to your data, and it just raises questions here. So in an iterative fashion, that's how you explicate and you try to develop your theories and work your theories out and then try and break them down and so on and so forth, if that helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, then maybe connecting more with what you talked about more recently in your presentation about a publication plan or plan of publication trajectory and so on. How do we plan for such a, how do you make such a plan? And also if you could comment a little bit more about when you say when you're younger in your career, you can maybe keep an eye on quantity, and then as you go on, you focus more a bit on quality. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that, Alex. I definitely think that you should have some sort of plan. And for every paper, I mean, I've got there's a special issue out just now, for example, Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And no doubt Diane's looking at as well, because it's a very, very good journal. And for the first time, they've got a special issue out on social entrepreneurship. Now, I've never published in that journal, and we don't really know an awful lot about strategic issues relating to entrepreneurship. So, but what we do is we're guided by the call for papers, and we think actually there's a few things here that we have written about, or there's a few things that we know, but you know what? There's an awful lot of reading we're going to have to do. So basically, it's a sense of if you're aiming for a particular journal, then you need to make time for it. And if it's a really good journal, then it might take you a year, it might take you 6 months and 9 months. And it might, I mean, at the moment, it's myself, Simon Teasdale and Alex Nichols are meeting every single Friday morning at 9 o'clock. And that's putting pressure on us basically to make sure that we actually do something between meetings to make sure that one of us is doing something with it. So I'm doing a bit of the literature review at the moment. Simon's doing a bit of the front end of the framing. Alex, I know, is going to do a bit of the empirical stuff, and then once we do that, we'll meet up at the end to do the so what part and the contribution to knowledge. Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. All I'm saying is that you need to have a plan for every paper you do. You also need to have a kind of long-term, medium-term, but the reason why I'm not answering your question directly is because the plan will look differently depending on A, where you are in your career, B, demands upon you, because frankly, I'm a researcher, so I don't have a great deal of teaching commitments. I know fine well that the best laid plans of every professor or every lecturer are completely go out the window when things like we have to move on to online teaching, for example, it just disrupts everything. So what I'm saying is that you make your plan which is right for you, which is right for your career and what your career looks like based upon what your life also looks like. What kind of work-life balance do you want? You've got kids. If you've got kids, for example, I've got kids. I don't have young kids anymore, but how on earth can you fit your research aspirations into trying to manage a family as well? You know, all these or I'm moving house though, so how am I going to organize it? And I've got carer responsibilities for my wife. So how can I work my life around and that type of having that type of plan or coming up with that type of plan? So sorry if that's a long-winded answer to that, which seems like quite a simple question, but it's not. It's actually quite a difficult question.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps there are a few questions that I could summarize. Question about speed of publication. One is asking what are some of the more accommodating journals you would recommend in the field. I guess as you're starting out and you're trying to land your paper and get that quantity early on. And the second question is about the comparison between, from Nadine, between quant and qual research. With quant studies, she's saying we can sort of slice the study and go for some publications while you wrapping up your PhD. But with qual data, you have to wait until the very end when your themes have emerged or whatever analysis you're doing for you to be able to publish. Any advice on how to go about getting published quickly?
To answer that last question first, it doesn't actually follow that you have to wait right to the very end. I mean, every qualitative study that I've been involved in has phases, different phases of study. So you'll maybe do one part of field work and then another part of field work, or because as I said, it usually is an iterative process, particularly over the course of a PhD. I mean, I'd be very surprised if any PhD student is, you know, goes into the field and then just goes into the field for 2 weeks and then comes back and then doesn't go into the field ever again. You know, usually it's they'll do one part and then maybe do another part and then reflect upon that, maybe do another part and then do some kind of different type of analysis. So natural, and your literature review, for example. Now, this is a bit of a tip for people. I did a systematic review for my literature review when I was doing my PhD, and I got it published in Social Science and Medicine. It was the very first systematic review that's ever been published in this field, and it's been really highly cited. I was about to say it's my highest. It's not my highest because people are obsessed with social impact bonds, and my social impact bonds paper has gone through the roof because it was one of the first to critique social impact bonds. But it's been very highly cited, and it's publishable in its own right. Usually nobody cares about a literature review. So if you do something smart, like do a scoping review, do a fully blown systematic review in the first year and a half of your PhD, then wow, that will really, you know, probably, hopefully by the time you finished, it will be accepted and you'll be off, because that'll be, you know, people are crying out for those types of really, really robust ways of assessing literature, etc. So if anyone's not heard of systematic reviewing, then go and look it up. It's not easy to do, and it takes a long time, but it's well worth it, I would recommend.
Yeah, and by the way, from a quant world perspective, it's not that advisable to slice our PhD study in any case.
No. No, it's cheating. It's not cheating, it's not really, but what I'm saying is that
even quantitative researchers, of course, they need to wait for their data to come in and analyze it at once. Then, of course, they can plan. If they see there is too much to tell in one paper, they will apportion it, not slice it, apportion it on different papers telling a different story, and make sure there is not too much of an overlap. So if that's the case, if it justifies a second paper or a third one, then of course they do it, but it's not that very early on they can publish, and they would also look at a systematic literature review opportunity as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Perhaps, Michael, if I may, I see one question which I find also quite interesting, because I struggle with it myself, is that sometimes when you do qualitative research, it's quite open-ended. So you haven't decided specifically on any research, proposition or how you want to call it. And so you end up researching and finding lots and lots of interesting stuff. And so, yeah, you get actually lost. And so it's very difficult deciding on what to do and to stick with some plan, because there really isn't any plan. So do you have any recommendation on this process?
Yeah, I do. And but don't repeat it out these four walls. In a PhD, it's good for people to get lost once in a while, okay? Because especially in the first year of a PhD, is go and have a look at this literature. If you disappear down any rabbit warrens, or it feels a bit like Alice in Wonderland, then we'll try and it's up to the supervisors then to pull you out of there. If, however, you're a tenured professor and you do that, then that's not a good use of your time, frankly. So you need to just be regimented and pragmatic. But secondly, it comes down to a plan. So the bottom line is, have a think about a target journal, and B, what is the answer? And then work, and then work, what gap do you want to fill? And then thirdly, how then are you going to fill it through empirical data? So it's almost like you're not coming up with the answer, but you're coming up with the answer to start off with, and then using data to try and support that. But that's also not a non-ethical thing to do, but it's a pragmatic thing to do, I would say. It's a bit like slicing of different data as well. You know, it's having to think about what do you want the answer to be, and then how, or what do you want the answer to say, because you know a particular gap exists. But that's, I hope nobody's listening to this, but that's because that's a terrible thing to do.
Perhaps one more, if I may, is about this publishing strategy, because I often see people doing some sort of waterfall cascading approach. So they aim very high. They hope they get good, they don't get that's rejected, and at least get some good feedback. And then they, you know, they cascade down.
Yeah.
So sometimes I wonder if there is a way to improve this process into more of a salmon approach, where you send out the paper to, let's say, a good conference, you get really good feedback, and you use that feedback to improve the paper, and then try to move up the ladder rather than always going down. Is that something that you find reasonable, or is that, you know, just...
No. I think Philip, you've hit the nail on the head. The very best thing you can do is present at conferences for precisely that reason, because it gives you the feedback and it gives you the confidence to know whether you're on the right lines, or, you know, that type of thing. So there's various conferences, for example, the EGOS conferences. The EGOS conference is great because it's a developmental conference. I don't know if anyone knows about EGOS, or if it's or any organization scholars here. I don't know whether I am or not, but I went to the EGOS conference, and it was fabulous because you have to submit your paper in advance, and they spend a good 20 minutes to half an hour just giving you feedback on your paper. You have literally 2 minutes to present the paper, but everyone else has read it, and they allocate someone to start off the feedback. So basically it's a developmental conference. And I would always recommend a developmental conference, particularly if you're not so much in the early phases, but if you've got a really good idea, you've got a nice paper which is taking shape, but you don't know how it's going to fly. You might want to send it to that. The second thing as well is, it's quite a high risk strategy, is to send it to a journal with expectation that it's probably going to pass the desk reject. It's not going to get desk rejected, but it's going to go to reviews. And I would say to anyone that reviews are always really, really worthwhile. That generally speaking, people give their advice in a very open way, in a very constructive way, and you should always take that advice on board. If people don't understand your work, it's not their problem, it's your problem, you know. So you obviously then need to rephrase it in such a way that people do understand it, that it's understandable. So that I would always say that submitting to a paper, submitting to a journal when something's ready to be submitted is always a good way of improving your work. And you're right, it doesn't always follow that after getting rejection and incorporating the comments, you might decide actually it's, you should aim higher, because now it's a far better paper now that you've rectified the issues, that the reviewers raised it in the first place.
Yeah, and perhaps as a short comeback, even if you cannot attend a conference because of financial reasons, we've all been there. It's not unethical to submit, even if you know that you cannot attend, because you're paying back in reviewing also. So you submit a paper, but you're also paying back the community by reviewing after submission. So even if you know that perhaps the Academy of Management conference is out of sight in terms of finances, it's not unethical or immoral to submit there and get good feedback, to be honest, which you can build on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay, how are we doing? Sorry, I'm looking at the time here. I'm just thinking, when you want to wrap up, Alex?
We're doing wonderfully. I think we've tried our best to address all the comments. Some comments were sort of combined together, so I hope we've done justice to all your comments. And I think we basically ready to wrap up. Can I throw in a last question? Maybe
Please do. Yeah.
Maybe just coming back to the philosophy of science when conducting research, would you say we should allow this to emerge from the way we sort of naturally look at phenomena, or must I enter my research with the sort of pre-chosen research philosophy of science that will determine the way I look at the type of questions I ask, how I look at the data, and how I interpret it?
That's a great question, Alex. I think people are naturally drawn, because of their inclinations, to particular topics. And quite frankly, if they study something to the extent that you need to study, so I believe it or not, when I left school, I went to become an engineer, and I did engineering for approximately a year and a half. And then I was really crap at it, because I had to do numbers and I had to do Monte Carlo distribution and Poisson distribution. And I didn't have a clue about any of that stuff. So I didn't fit in very well. And then I left and went to work in a shop. And I did that for a number of years, and then found myself in the civil service, and then was supported to, I wanted to get promotion, so they supported me to do my degree. So I finished my degree and I did social sciences. And it was only when I did social sciences that I realized this is actually where my heart lies. And this is why I was really interested, why I was so engaged in it. And frankly, you become good at something because you're interested in it. And there's always things that you don't like, or you don't like about it, or whatever, but generally speaking, you find your home, and if you find your home, if you're a PhD and you find your home, then that's great. And most people finish the PhD not because they're not clever enough, because everyone who gets onto a PhD is clever enough to do a PhD, or 99.9% of them are. It's actually, if you've got the staying power to get through that whole process, because it actually chimes with your own personal, your own morals, that's your own way of viewing the world. So I think it's about finding your home, Alex. And once you find your home, then generally speaking, there are methods and methodologies that come out of what your home looks and feels like, that feel natural to that. It's only when you start doing things that don't fit with the philosophy that starts to feel unworkable and tough and hard to do, etc. But effectively, once you find your home, then it should all come naturally. It shouldn't be hard. It should feel natural, and natural, whatever that means. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I do feel more relieved to think, okay, I can be myself, and then there will be sort of a label for my philosophy, but sort of, yeah. Okay. I think we are done for the day. We've learned a lot, as I was saying, and especially myself. So thank you once again, Michael, for the time you put into this session and all the insights. I feel like you're a well of of knowledge in this field, but also in this method. And we just only threw in a bit of a bucket. There's so much we can still draw out, but time is ticking. So thanks for your time, and thanks everyone for attending and supporting us with these webinars and supporting the network. And we hope to see you in the other webinars. So coming up on the 12th of November at 4 p.m. South African time still, is publishing quantitative papers in academic journals, this time with Tom Lumpkin, and we hope to see you there.